bosun, pipe him aboard.
Aye, aye, sir.
Fire, dress ship.
Very good, sir. Dress ship!
A Brief History of Man's Maritime Mastery. Chapter 11. Scrappy Seadogs Subvert Spanish Supremacy. In the stillness of the night, 4 small ships glide silently across the inky waters, their sails billowing in the faint breeze as if propelled by the shadows themselves. Aboard one of these vessels, a fiery-eyed man, none other than Francis Drake, surveys the dark horizon. His voice, a harsh whisper, cuts through the night as he orders his band of cloaked men to ready themselves. The oars are drawn in, weapons are gripped tightly. Muskets, small cannons, bows, and fire pikes with their deadly combustible ends. The only sounds are the gentle swirl of the sea against the shore and the soft sigh of the wind through the palms. The 4 boats, like phantoms, drift ashore. A few men are left to guard the boats while Drake, with a determined gleam in his eye, leads the others up the hill. There, on the hill, in the pale light of the moon, the brass barrels of cannons gleam, an ominous sight. This is Nombre de Dios, the key to Spain's treasure-laden galleons that shuttle the wealth of South America back to Europe. The port sleeps peacefully, oblivious to the approaching danger. After all, who in the year of our Lord 1572 would dare challenge the might of the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean? Perhaps the Cimarroons, the runaway slaves turned fierce warriors, might attack, but from the dense jungle, not the sea. A single sentry paces lazily among the harbor cannons, his vigilance dulled by the calm night. Suddenly, a rustle in the dark. The sentry turns just in time to see Drake's men, like specters, leap over the parapet. They wrench the cannons from their mounts, sending them crashing down the hillside. Panic grips the sentry as he races to sound the alarm. The great bell in the church tower rings out, its clanging echoing through the night. From the town below comes the cries of startled men and women, the hurried clatter of feet on cobblestones, as the town awakens to chaos. Drake, ever the strategist, sends his younger brother John with 12 men to flank the town, to strike from the opposite side in a pincer attack. With the town now fully alerted, Drake orders his drummers and trumpeters to sound. The air fills with the stirring beats of drums and the sharp calls of trumpets, as Drake and his men march boldly down Main Street, their flaming fire pikes held high, casting a hellish glow that strikes terror into the hearts of the defenders. In the marketplace, the Spanish soldiers scramble into formation, hastily lashing on armor, unsheathing swords, and priming their clumsy muskets. Drake's men unleash a deadly volley, and with a fearsome roar they charge with their pikes. At that very moment, John Drake and his handful of men burst in from the opposite flank, catching the Spaniards off guard. The attackers are like a tidal wave crashing into the town. The Spaniards, taken by surprise, break ranks, but not before getting off one desperate volley. A trumpeter falls, others are wounded, but the town is taken. The victory is Drake's, or so it seems. As if the very heavens themselves disapprove of this audacious raid, the skies suddenly darken, and a tropical rain begins to pour with such ferocity that it blinds the combatants. The downpour extinguishes the fire pikes, soaks the matches, and renders musket and cannon alike useless. Powder becomes sludge, bowstrings slacken, and the men, now drenched and disheartened, take shelter under a veranda, cursing the rain that has stolen their triumph. When the rain finally ceases, Drake steps out, and for the first time his men see that he is wounded, his clothing soaked with blood. Realizing the severity of the situation, they refuse to risk his life any further. Gently they lift their wounded leader and carry him back to the boats, retreating him into the dawn. Drake may have failed to hold Nombre de Dios, but he is not defeated. For Drake, the riches of the Spanish still beckon. If Nombre de Dios is now too strongly defended, then he will intercept the treasure before it ever reaches the port. He knows well the route. The gold and silver mined in the distant lands of Chile and Peru are brought to Panama's Pacific coast, then packed onto mules and hauled across the isthmus to the Caribbean side. Drake's allies, the Cimarroons, show him the way. In the dense underbrush along the mule track, Drake's men crouch silently, joined by their Cimarroon allies and a few French freebooters. They listen intently to the sounds of the jungle, the call of the birds, the distant ring of the shipwrights' hammers, and the increasing bustle of Nombre de Dios just a few miles away. Then at last a distant brassy sound rises, mingling with the murmur of the other noises. It grows louder, a swelling chorus of harness bells, the creak of leather, the grunts of drivers, the stamp of mules, and the tramp of armed men. It is the unmistakable sound of a treasure caravan. With a quick, decisive word from Drake, his men spring into action, seizing both the lead and last mules of each string, holding them fast. Muskets roar, arrows fly, and steel clashes on steel. The defenders, taken by surprise, fall, and the Spaniards, realizing their plight, flee back to Nombre de Dios. But once again the infernal church bell rings out, spreading panic through the town. Swiftly Drake's men strip the mules of their precious cargo. The silver is buried, but the gold and casks of jewels are shouldered. They strike out for their hidden base, where their ships await them. At last Drake can turn to his men and say with grim satisfaction, "Our voyage is made." What is it that drove Francis Drake, the preacher's son from the quiet shores of Devon, to become the scourge of King Philip's Spain? How did this once sweet young man evolve into a feared seafarer who would go on to singe the beard of the Spanish king? To understand Drake's transformation, we must journey back to a fateful voyage, a voyage that would forever alter the course of his life and, indeed, the course of history. Drake's early days on the high seas were not as a marauder but as a trader. He joined his cousin John Hawkins on what they deemed a legitimate trading mission to Spanish America. They brought bales of fine taffeta and linen, barrels of sack and Malmsey wine, and African slaves, all intended to be traded for gold. But Spain's King Philip had other ideas. He had decreed that the Americas were Spain's private domain, off limits to all but Spanish ships. Yet greed and necessity have a way of bending rules, and local officials often turned a blind eye to the English traders, for slaves were in short supply and the market was ripe. But fortune turned against Drake and Hawkins in the port of San Juan de Ulua, Mexico. Just as they were concluding their trade, a Spanish fleet arrived bearing a new viceroy, an official who would not tolerate such a blatant disregard for his king's commands. In a cunning move, the viceroy promised not to attack the English if they allowed him to enter the harbor unopposed. But, once safely inside, he betrayed them, launching a brutal assault. Of the 6 English ships, only 2 escaped. For Drake, the treachery was seared into his very soul. He swore revenge, a vow that would drive him to return not as a traitor, but as a raider. He would become like the French privateers who had harassed the Spanish in the Caribbean for decades. England, too, was ripe for such a man, for such a passion. The New World was barred to her by Spanish and Portuguese monopolies, and in Europe English ambitions were stifled by entrenched trading powers. Spanish plots, religious friction, and a growing sense of resentment demanded an outlet. Queen Elizabeth herself, driven by a desire for revenge against the diverse injuries she had suffered at Spanish hands, quietly supported Drake's exploits. Yet Drake's ambitions did not stop in the Caribbean. In 1578, aboard his 100-ton ship, the Golden Hind, Drake set his sights on the untamed Pacific coast of South America. The Golden Hind, a ship as nimble as she was sturdy, made her way up the coast, her sails billowing under a favorable wind. By the rail stands a dark, brooding figure, Nuno da Silva, a Portuguese pilot kidnapped by Drake to help him navigate these unfamiliar waters. His Portuguese charts are Drake's guide in this bold venture. A trumpet blares, and from the galley emerges the cook, carrying a massive tray piled high with silver dishes. 2 musicians with viols take their positions by the cabin door, and out steps a stocky little man, dressed in the height of Elizabethan fashion, his clothes scented and pristine. This is Captain General Drake. His eyes scan the horizon with a careful gaze that misses nothing. Satisfied, he steps into the cabin where the strains of music mingle with the sound of the ship's wake. Life aboard the Golden Hind is a mix of routine and reverence. The men dine well on thick pea soup and boiled cod, and after the meal, boys dance and sailors skylark under a tropical sun. Day after day passes in such a rhythm, punctuated by daily religious services and the occasional raid on a settlement, where Drake and his men take what they need, or what they desire. One time they seize a ton of silver from the backs of llamas. Another time they overtake a lone treasure ship, its holds filled with riches but devoid of the cannons that might have defended them. Spanish vessels along the Pacific coast often sail unarmed, for only Spaniards dare to sail these waters. Northward the Golden Hind sails, trailing her wake like mermaid's hair on the deep blue sea. After a failed attempt to find the Northwest Passage, Drake makes landfall in California, claiming the land for his queen and christening it New Albion. Then, with a westward turn, he embarks on a daring voyage across the vast Pacific, raising land in just 68 days. At the Spice Islands, he takes on fresh supplies, then makes a record-breaking non-stop run of 9,700 miles from Java to Sierra Leone, an achievement no ship had ever made before. In September 1580, after nearly 3 years at sea, the Golden Hind sails triumphantly into Plymouth Sound. As Drake steps ashore, a cry goes up, "Does Queen Elizabeth live?" For Drake knows that his voyage will be counted as a success only if his queen still reigns. She does indeed live, and more than that, she thrives, for the queen and her ministers had invested in Drake's ventures, and their gamble paid off handsomely, with a return to the tune of some 4,700%. Spain, however, is understandably furious. The Spanish ambassador fumes, burning with rage against this upstart Englishman. But, back in England, the Golden Hind is celebrated. She comes to anchor at Deptford on the Thames, where Queen Elizabeth herself boards the ship to knight her pirate captain, the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe.